Hello, my name is Leslie Berger, and I would like to invite you to Renew. Renew is a show about the College of Forest Resources at Mississippi State University. The College of Forest Resources promotes and enables the conservation, management, and wise use of our natural resources. Today's show is going to feature one of the three departments within the College of Forest Resources, the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. And I have two members of the department here to tell us a little bit about their work, Dr. Mark McConnell and his graduate student, Trey Wall. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
So I'm glad to have you here to learn a little about some of the work that you're doing. I'm actually a little bit familiar with some of the work that you've been doing, Mark, for a long time. And your work has been centered, really since your graduate school days, on wildlife conservation in agricultural landscapes. What are some of the greatest challenges that we have in trying to produce the food and the other materials that we need to support our societies as we know them and peoples across the world, but also leave a space for wildlife?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really what's driven most of my research for the last decade. The challenges are that it's hard to feed a growing human population and provide food security and not have an adverse effect on our natural resources, specifically wildlife. There are opportunities to kind of bridge those gaps, but they occur typically in areas that are least likely to be farmed or in areas that are low productivity areas of a farm. Those create some opportunities to create wildlife conservation areas and areas that wildlife can sustain in these intensive landscapes. But at the end of the day, you're trying to feed the world, have sustainable crops, and keep as many wildlife in the landscape as possible. And it is a real challenge.
Right, because you really can't optimize both or maximize both.
Can't maximize both.
Can't have both at the same time. There's going to have to be trade-offs, compromises in how we use that land.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, feeding the world is going to always be the number one priority, and it probably should be to some degree. What we've tried to do the last decade is figure out ways to marry those two together and find ways we can slip in a little conservation into a production agricultural system, keep good production agriculture productive, and take the less productive agriculture and make it more wildlife friendly.
Right, because you don't have to farm every inch. If it's costing you money to continue to farm in that low place of the field that's floods or has poor yields because of poor soils, you might be able to do something else there.
Yeah, the days of farming every acre and fence row to fence row, there was a time in this country where that was the national policy, and it was promoted from USDA to do that. Those days are largely behind us. We can identify where very unproductive ground is, where farmers are actually losing money by farming it, and we can work with farmers to get those areas into a conservation practice that in most cases will pay the farmer not to farm it, and trying to make as much money as you can off your really productive acres and then still get paid for your less productive acres to keep them in something wildlife friendly.
Right. Because at the end of the day, they have to earn money for their family to pay their bills just like everybody else who's not a farmer.
Yeah, we've spent the last decade trying to show the economic opportunities that conservation, the economic opportunities of conservation in ag landscapes in this country, and they're vast. We've got a really diverse farm bill program. We've got a really good price support mechanisms. We've got a lot of ways to help farmers keep their revenue up, and conservation is one of the tools they can employ.
Okay. So Trey, you're a student here working with Dr. McConnell, and so I assume that means you have an interest in this topic of conservation in ag landscapes, or maybe related to some of the upland bird species that you work with, like northern bobwhite quail. So tell me a little bit about the project that you're doing.
So right now I'm working in the Delta, and I'm researching northern bobwhite habitat restoration in an exotic invaded ecosystem, basically.
So it was astounding to me one time when I was in the Delta maybe 2 years ago, and we were standing in a large agricultural setting. We were actually doing an educational workshop for landowners, and there were ginormous fields all around us. But there were little brushy places that were intersecting these fields, and I heard a quail calling, and it just blew my mind, because it did not seem like a very quail-friendly landscape. But what you're doing is actually trying to understand that system more?
Sure, yeah. Especially in defense of habitat when there's a very noxious weed taking over what could be usable, valuable quail habitat.
Okay, so what specific weeds are you looking at then?
So it's called Sericea lespedeza. Some people call it Chinese bush clover. It's kind of like the supervillain of plants. So it does really good at surviving, and we're not very good at killing it.
Yes, I think I have some memories as an undergraduate quite some time ago where that was actually potentially even being promoted as a wildlife habitat plant, and certainly for soil erosion plant. And now we have learned more, as science does, and we've perhaps changed our tune a little bit.
We hope. I found recently, in fact, in the East Coast somewhere, a farmer or a group of farmers promoting what they called Sericea Field Day, where they were trying to sell it, and that's not good for bobwhite or any wildlife species.
So what specifically about that plant makes it not a good choice for wildlife?
It essentially grows in a monoculture. It mats the ground, it's really thick, and it totally eliminates any usable space for a quail to be able to move around, and it suffocates the native plants that we do want, and it changes the insect population that quail need to eat as babies. So.
Yeah, that's very, I mean, most people aren't going to understand that complexity of it. So maybe Dr. McConnell, you can give us a little bit like the biology of a quail 101 to kind of marry what Trey was just telling us about.
Yeah, so when a quail hatches, it's about the size of a bumblebee. And as soon as their natal down dries, the attending parent takes them and they go cruising for bugs. And to cruise for bugs, a bobwhite chick needs bare ground, good overhead cover, and a lot of herbaceous vegetation to attract insects. Their diet's primarily insects at the very beginning of their life. And Sericea lespedeza is so thick, like on Trey's study site, 8 feet tall, maybe 10?
It's about 5 to 6 feet.
Okay, it's really tall. Yeah. And unfortunately, it's not the only invasive out there. There's 3 or at least, yeah. But anyway, the chicks just actually cannot walk through it and forage. And one part of his study is actually using chicks, imprinted chicks, to actually let them forage in spots where we're doing multiple different controls of Sericea, types of control with prescribed fire and chemical combinations, in addition to where we're doing nothing, and let the chicks actually tell us which combination of fire and chemical herbicide actually created the best situation for chicks to be able to forage. And that's the first time that'll be done. We know how to kill Sericea, but we don't know if chicks can forage in it or how efficient they can be if they're foraging in certain areas we're trying to control it. But yeah, you're right, we planted it a long time ago and we promoted it. And to the point Trey was making earlier, it actually, I think, has a natural deworming effect for some small ruminants, some goats. So it's actually being promoted in some universities as a legume for forage for goats to help with internal parasites, which is not what we want, obviously.
Right. So then we're back again on that. What do you need for that landscape? And so really, if you are a goat farmer and that is something you're trying to do, you're not necessarily concerned about quail, or you're not in a place where quail naturally would occur, maybe it's not a bad thing. But in the Delta of Mississippi, where there are quail, and there could be more quail if the habitat supported them, then having them fight for habitat and fight against a noxious weed that doesn't support the food that they need, doesn't provide the cover that their chicks need, then that's just another strike against them that makes it that much harder.
Exactly.
So Mark, tell me, you've got a lot of projects going on.
I do.
And not to, maybe hate on Trey's, but what project are you really excited about?
Well, since he's right beside me, I'm really excited about Trey's. We're trying to do something novel with each project. Trey's has a novel component to it in a couple of different ways. We've also got some radio telemetry on some quail in a property in West Point, Mississippi, that we're answering some novel questions there about how quail determine or choose where they want to roost at night. There hasn't been any research on that during the breeding season, which is what we're focusing on. I've got a student working on turkey population dynamics and effects of looking at different ways to adjust harvest frameworks. That's really exciting. And then I've got a handful of students looking at different ways quail move across the landscape, some working on some precision ag work. I couldn't choose one, but since he's here, I'll say Trey was the first project I started when I got to Mississippi State. And so I have a special affinity for that one.
Right. The first graduate student always has a special spot. Kind of like having the firstborn kid.
Sure.
Like
I wouldn't give him that much credit. Yeah.
So Trey, tell me how you imprint quail chicks. What is that process?
So it's pretty involved. I haven't gotten quite to that point yet, but from what I understand, it's a lot of time spent with the chicks for upwards of almost 2 weeks, and they will essentially follow you around like you're their mother, and then they'll follow you into the woods, and they'll eat naturally, and then that'll tell us a lot.
So as the egg is hatching or getting ready to hatch, you'll be in there talking to them, and so it hears the sound of your voice, and when you communicate, then it's going to think you're its mom,
Sure. Yeah.
dad.
He will be the mom.
Yeah, I'll be the mom. And I think some people have used noise-making instruments, so it's like the Pied Piper, you know, the little quail following you around. So.
But because they're not afraid, they're going to act naturally, and you'll be able to then study how these birds would behave in the wild in a way that you wouldn't able to do if they were wild. I mean, they're going to be unafraid, and they can forage and eat bugs, and you can see if they're struggling over tall vegetation,
Exactly.
or be able to move through there.
Exactly.
Yeah, some of the earliest research using them to assess forage habitat was actually done at Mississippi State, was through Tall Timbers at Mississippi State. That was some of the first research on using imprinted bobwhite chicks for that, and it's really effective. They're still going to go find bugs, and regardless. Yeah.
Well, and people may have seen some of the early work in this arena where people were imprinting waterfowl on them. So I think about this one particular image where the man is in the water and the goslings are all around him because he has those goslings imprinted on him.
Exactly.
And it's a technique that they use for teaching migratory birds like whooping cranes on how to move from their natal areas to their migration areas. So it's interesting that you can take that same kind of science and apply it to a whole nother organism like the bobwhite quail.
Exactly.
So we only have a little bit of time left, but I know that bobwhite is a species of interest to many people in Mississippi and really across the Southeast. And there are a lot of perhaps misconceptions or misunderstandings about what has happened to that species over time, because you hear stories about how they used to be really common and they're not. So what are some of the primary factors, and I'll let either one of you answer that are causing the decline of bobwhite regionally?
The short answer is we've lost a lot of their habitat. The way we farm, the way we manage pine trees, so everything from industrialized pine farming to extensive and aggressive row crop agricultural to exotic forage grasses for livestock forage production. All those things make up a great deal of the landscape, and when you combine those things with invasive exotic plants and a reduction in fire across the Southeast, all that is a perfect storm to just have a species slowly decline for several decades.
Mm-hmm. So in places where they have been doing intentional management, they have been able to recover them.
Yeah.
So that's a happy story. We may never have them at the levels that we had in maybe the 1930s or 40s when we were doing small agriculture, but with some intentional action, using the science we have available to us, we might be able to turn it around a little bit.
Without question. Where people are trying to keep bobwhites, there are bobwhites.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you two coming by, and I wish you the best as you move forward on your graduate work. I know you've got a great advisor here in Dr. McConnell. I hope the rest of you enjoyed learning a little bit about the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture and the research that's happening to conserve our wildlife in agricultural systems. I've been your host, Leslie Berger, for Renew.